Hey guys, so if you've done the right thing, you've read the summaries and you've gone through and you have watched the video on the summary. That's really important because it's very hard to understand philosophical text without the prior knowledge to back it up. So what we're going to do now is read the text, and this time we're going to perform a more developed reading of the Wax argument. So see the differences and the subtleties in his argument, and then look at his argument about the role of the mind in perception, and also that other conclusion that he makes, which is that we can know the mind more clearly or better than we know the body or the world of physical objects. So we need to draw on prior knowledge from summaries, and then we need to perform more nuanced understanding of Descartes' arguments. So we need to perform a nuanced reading, I should say, of Descartes' arguments. Now, you should remember the summary, so this should not be that hard for you. What I'd like you to do is to draw as many different shapes of melted wax as you can in 30 seconds. Can you do that for me, please? All right, make sure you quickly score yourself on these two success criteria. And once you've done that, let's head over to the text, which I'm going to read to you. All right, so we're starting off here. Just remember he's talked about the fact that if I can be deceived or if I'm in this dream world, again, I must be the thing that is thinking, all right? So from all this I begin to have a rather better understanding of what I am, but it still appears, and I cannot stop thinking this, that the corporal, remember corporal means body, things of which images are formed in my thought and which the senses investigate are known with much more distinctness, which means you can easily separate them and you can see them as individual objects, are known with much more distinctness than this puzzling I, which cannot be pictured in the imagination. And yet it is surely surprising that I should have a more distinct grasp of things which I realize are doubtful, unknown, and foreign to me than I have of that which is true and known, i.e. myself. So it's pretty clearly saying, isn't it weird that just upon reflection now, it's bizarre, but I've always assumed that I have a better understanding about the differences and the distinctness, and it's not so vague to understand the world of material objects. But as I've said in my previous readings, that's just weird because this is full of, well, this could be a world of an illusion, full of doubtful objects and doubtful qualities. So let's see what he has to say about this. But I see what it is. My mind enjoys wandering off, and I will not yet submit to being restrained within the bounds of truth. So in other words, in the past, I've just let my mind wander, but now I need to be disciplined, and I need to use my methodological doubt and my inquiry in order to pursue truth. Very well then, just this once, let us give it a completely free rein, so that after a while, when it is time to tighten the reins, that I might be more readily to submit to being curbed, or means held back. Let us consider things which people commonly think they understand most distinctly of all. That is, the bodies in which we touch and see. I do not mean bodies in general, for general perceptions are more apt to be somewhat more confused, but of one particular body. Let's take, for example, this piece of wax. It has been taken from honeycomb. It has not yet quite lost its taste of honey, and it retains some of the scent of the flowers from which it was gathered. Its colour, its shape, its size, it's plain to see. It is hard and cold, and it can be handled without difficulty if you rap it with your knuckle, and it makes a sound. So what he's basically done here deliberately is talked about how all the senses are involved in detecting the honeycomb, okay? In short, it has everything which appears necessary to enable a body to be known as distinctly as possible. Can you take a note about that? Basically, the qualities of the object have everything within it in order to be able to be known. So I don't know about you, but I'm thinking the senses detect the qualities, and obviously it has to own the qualities that the senses detect. Take a note. But even as I speak, I put the wax by the fire, and look, the residual taste is eliminated, the smell goes away, the colour changes, the shape is lost, the size increases, and it becomes liquid and hot, and you can hardly touch it. And if you strike it, it no longer makes a sound. But does the same wax remain? It must be admitted that it does. No one denies it. No one thinks otherwise. So what was in the wax? What was it in the wax that I understood with such distinctness? Evidently, none of the features which I arrived at by means of the senses. So it's basically saying all the the senses are detecting new qualities once it's been melted, right? So therefore, how can it be the senses that have the understanding, right? Because how can it be the features through which he arrived at, through the senses? Well, it can't be, because it can't be the features that trigger off the senses because they've completely changed. For whatever came under taste, smell, sight, touch, or hearing is now altered. That's what he says, yet the wax still remains. Perhaps the answer lies in thought, which now comes to my mind, namely, that the wax was not after all the sweetness of the honey, or the fragrance of the flowers, or the whiteness, or the shape, or the sound, but was rather a body which presented itself to me in these various forms a little while ago, but which now exhibits different ones. So it still has a body, the senses still see the body. Take a note. Even though it's a different body, senses still see one thing in common in the solid state and the melted state, that it has a body. But what exactly is it that I'm now imagining? Let us concentrate. Take away everything which does not belong to the wax and see what is left, merely something extended, flexible, and changeable. So really the senses are detecting those things that are extended, that exist in space with 3 dimensions. They can change and are flexible. What is meant here by flexible and changeable is what I picture in my imagination. So here's where the nuances start to happen. He's saying, look, my senses understand the wax to be flexible and changeable, but is flexible something which I know through my imagination? That this piece of wax is capable of changing from a round shape to a square shape, or from a square shape to a triangular shape? Not at all. For I cannot grasp the wax is capable of countless changes of this kind, yet I am unable to run through the immeasurable number of changes in my imagination, from which it follows that it is not the faculty of imagination that gives me my grasp of the wax as flexible and changeable. So we know that the object is flexible and changeable. We can see it happen over time, but we can't imagine its flexibility and changeability at all, because that means we have to imagine the wax in many different forms or shapes. In fact, I think in my mind map, we got it a bit wrong. We do see the changeability and the flexibility, but knowing that it is flexible and changeable has to be performed by the mind. I think that's where we're going, okay? And what is meant by extension? Is the extension of the wax also unknown? For it increases if the wax melts, increases again if it boils, and greater still if the heat is increased. Would it not be making a correct judgment about the nature of wax? I would not be making a correct judgment about the nature of wax unless I believed it capable of being extended in many more different ways than I will ever encompass in my imagination. I must therefore admit that the nature of this piece of wax is in no way revealed by my imagination, but is perceived by the mind alone. So here's the nuanced reading. The extension, the flexibility, and the changeability are qualities that are understood by the mind, because he said here the nature of the wax. So it's not the fact that it is just the wax. I mean, that's one of the components. Yes, this is wax, but it's also those ideas of extension, extension, flexibility, and changeability. They all tend to be things that are understood by the mind alone. Okay, they can't be imagined. So in speaking of this particular piece of wax, the point is even clearer that I regard to wax in the general. Okay, but what is the wax which is perceived by the mind alone? It is, of course, the same wax which I see, which I touch, which I picture in my imagination. In short, the same wax which I thought to be from the start, which I thought it to be from the start. And yet, here is the point. The perception I have of it is a case not of vision or touch or imagination, nor has it ever been, despite previous appearances, but of purely mental scrutiny. And this can be imperfect and confused as it was before, or clear and distinct as it is now, depending on how carefully I concentrate on what the wax consists in. So let's just make one thing clear. The nature of the wax isn't known through the senses or through imagination. So it's not just that we may see change, flexibility, and extension in the actual property of the wax, but that very concept of changeability, flexibility, whatever, is all tied together by an understanding of what the nature is. And then we say the same about the wax itself. The qualities change infinitely over time. So there's a much more nuanced reading You need to write something down here about the fact that the nature of the wax is understood by the mind alone, not just the wax in and of itself. And write down why, and write down why with reference to that concept of flexibility, changeability, and extension. Okay, so let's see where he goes from here, shall we? Lots of writing. All right. But as I reach this conclusion, I'm amazed at how weak and prone to error my mind is. For though I am thinking about these matters within myself, silently and without speaking, nonetheless the actual words bring me up short, and I'm almost tricked by ordinary ways of talking. We say that the wax itself is, if it is there before us, not that we judge it to be there from the colour or the shape. And this might lead me to conclude that without more ado, which means fuss, that knowledge of the wax comes from the eyes, from what the eye sees, and not from the scrutiny of the mind alone. But then, if I look out the window and see men crossing the square, as I just happen to have done, I normally say that I see men themselves, just as I say that I see the wax. Yet do I see any more than hats and coats which can conceal automatons? Automatons is an old-fashioned word for kind of clockwork robots. So we're saying these guys could be just automatons, not necessarily men. I judge that they are men. So my mind performs this active action of judging, or deciding, or inferring from what I see. And so something which I thought I was seeing with my eyes is in fact grasped solely by the faculty of the judgment which is in my mind. So here we have the A is to C, A is to B as C is to D analogy. You know, the coats and the hats are to the men as the properties of the wax are to the wax. And of course, the properties of the wax change over time, given different circumstances. And obviously, the coats and the hats conceal the identity of the men. So basically, in both instances, what the thing actually is being judged by the mind, is being understood by the mind. Take a note. Right, so far the nuances are that it's not just the identity of the wax that's understood by the mind, but it's also the nature of the wax, i.e. it's changing extension, it's changing flexibility, and its change it's change in general. So, you know, these are the things that we know if we could, through understanding, because we can't imagine every particular form it takes in flexibility, extension, and change either, okay? Then we look at the coats thing, and that kind of proves that we kind of use the mind to tie together our understanding of what the senses are presenting us, okay? However, one who wants to achieve knowledge about the ordinary level should feel ashamed at having taken ordinary ways of talking for the basis of doubt. So let us proceed to discover, or to consider, on which occasion my perception of the nature of the wax is more perfect and evident. Was it when I first looked at it, and I believed that I knew my external senses, or at least by what they call the common sense, that in the power of imagination, that is the power of imagination, or is my knowledge more perfect now, after more careful investigation of the nature of the wax, of the means by which it is known, and any doubt on this issue would clearly be foolish, for what distinctness was there in my early perception? Was there anything in which an animal could not possess? But when I distinguish the wax from its outward forms, take the clothes off, as if it were, and consider it naked, then although my judgment may still contain errors, at least my perception now requires a human mind. So what he's saying here is I need to move away from, I know that the senses can easily be tricked, but there's absolutely no doubt that my mind is actually performing the action of perception. That's right behind it. But what am I to say about this mind, or about myself? For remember that I'm not admitting that there is anything else in me except a mind. What I ask is that this eye which seems to perceive the wax so distinctly, what I ask is this eye which seems to perceive the wax so distinctly. Surely my awareness of my own self is not merely much truer than and more certain than my awareness of the wax, but also much more distinct and evident. For if I judge that the wax exists from the fact that I see it, Clearly, this same fact entails much more evidently that I myself exist. So if I perceive, therefore I exist. You get what I mean? If I perceive, therefore I exist is the same thing as I think, therefore I am. Might want to write that down. It is possible that I see what I see is not really the wax. It is possible that I do not even have the eyes with which to see anything. But when I see or think I see, I'm not here distinguishing between the two. It is simply not possible that I am who that I who am now thinking and not something. Sorry, I'm going to read this again. It is simply not possible that I who am now thinking and not something. Let me just read this. Or I think I see. It is simply not possible that that I who am now thinking am not something. Okay, that's really badly written. It is simply not possible that I who am now thinking, so I'm performing the action of thinking, am not something, so I have to be. By the same token, if I judge that the wax exists from the front and that I touch it, the same result follows, namely that I exist. If I judge that it exists from the fact that I imagine it, or from any other reason, exactly the same thing follows. So all these things affirm my existence. Imagination affirms my existence, the sensation through touching, because it requires, again, some kind of understanding, or through seeing, because it requires some kind of understanding. All these actions affirm my existence. Take a note. And the result that I have grasped in the case of the wax may be applied to everything else located outside me. Moreover, if my perception of the wax seemed more distinct after it was established, not just by sight or by touch, by many other considerations, it must be admitted that I now know myself even more distinctly. So what he's saying is, after examining and considering the nature of perception, I know the mind much better. It's probably a better way of clearly saying it. So let's have a look. This is because every consideration whatsoever contributes to my perception of the wax or any other body cannot but establish even more effectively the nature of my own mind. So every time I consider what contributes to perception, I don't really understand the outside world that much. I understand my mind. Take a note. But besides this, there is so much else in the mind itself which can serve to make my knowledge, if not more distinct, that it scarcely seems worth going through the contributions made by concealing bodily things. So here is what he's saying, is that there's so much more that I can think about how I think and how I know, which I could probably be certain of, which makes it kind of useless to think about more bodily things or things outside of me. Take a note. I see that without any effort, I have now finally got back to where I wanted, and I know now that even bodies are not strictly perceived by the senses or the faculty of imagination, but by intellect alone. And this perception derives not from their being touched or seen, but from their being understood. I would highlight that. That is a perfect summary, that whole section all the way from I to understood, of what he actually believes. I would definitely write that down. It'd be a very good quote to use. And in my view, this I know plainly, that I can achieve an easier and more evident perception of my own mind than anything else. Again, that's also important. He's saying it's easier to understand my mind than anything else. And we know that because whenever we reflect on the nature of sense of perception or how the mind works, we know more about the mind. But we can't know much about the physical things we perceive because they could be illusions or deceptions, but we can definitely be certain about the nature involved in the actual mental predicate. Let's get reading. But since the habit of holding on to my opinions cannot be set aside so quickly, I should like to stop here and meditate this time on new knowledge that I have gained, so as to fix it deeply in my memory. Okay, and we will stop right there for now. Or shall we continue reading? Let me just pause and consider it. Okay, so the rest is what we have to study in the sixth meditation, which we'll do in another video. So, look, I mean, we have nuances here, and I guess it's really important that I did structure it that way. One of the things we need to know is that it's not just the wax itself, but it's the nature of the wax that is understood by the mind. So sure, once we melt the wax, it goes from all the properties it has in a solid state to all the properties it has in a melted state. And the only thing that can actually tie together an understanding that it is still the wax is the mind. If we use the imagination, we have to predict every possible form that it could achieve under every possible circumstance, which is impossible because it's too much effort and there's an infinite amount of variables to consider. It can't just be the sensations, right? It has to be, because the sensations are specific and individual, it has to be the mind that ties them together. But also, we see properties of the wax, which are other concepts, which are known through the mind and have to be known through the mind alone. The wax, when it's solid, has its own extension, which means shape, flexibility, and it has a change that we'll see over time. Once it's melted, we see the change, and then it has a new form, or it has a new extension, and it has new flexibility, right? So even the concepts of its flexibility, its change, and its extension have to be known through using the mind and applying an understanding of those concepts, or knowing those concepts as they are triggered by the sense data that we detect, okay? So we have got nuanced readings. And then, of course, we go into a really long kind of discussion about, well, okay, because foreseeably my sensations and things that are triggering this understanding could be generated as illusions. They are doubtful. I can't really know much about the physical world, but I can know more about how the mind is actively engaged, because the process of perceiving while imagining, while dreaming, while being deceived, or while detecting the real piece of wax, it all involves the same kind of mental processes. It all involves the same mind processes. So I not only affirm that I exist through the act of perceiving, but I affirm how I exist. And therefore we have the conclusion that we can know the mind much, much better and with more certainty than we can actually know the world of physical objects. And that makes a lot of sense. All right, if you didn't understand my little recap, you need to come and talk to me, because that's what was the whole point of the perceiving and the wax argument section. Okay, cheers.